So thank you everyone for coming, both in person and those who are here with us digitally. Let's start by setting motivation. So we'll begin with just a quick verse of refuge and bodhicitta. We will recite it 3 times in Tibetan and then once in English. Sangye Shudon Soki Shonam La Shanshu Parudani Kyam Suki Dagi Jinsongi Pe Sonam Gi Androla Penche Sangye Jupar Shok Sangye Shudon Soki Shonam La Shanshu Parudani Kyam Suki Dagi Jinsongi Pe Sonam Gi Androla Penche Sangye Jupar Shok Sangye Chiran Soki Shonam La Chanchu Barandane Gyalsu Shir Dagi Jinzongi Pe Sonam Gi Jola Penche Sangye Jupar Shok. In the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha, until enlightened I seek refuge through merit from giving and the rest. To wait all may I become Buddha. So we've joined together this afternoon for the purpose of reviewing the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or Holy Guru, especially on the topics of logic and epistemology as taught by Dharmakirti and Dignaga. And we don't do this for ourselves alone, but we do this so that we might improve our minds, improve our study, and improve our capacity to help other sentient beings. That our study of the path of Dharma might lead us to perfect, complete Buddhahood, so we might lead all beings out of suffering and into perfect bliss. So again, thank you for coming. So I'll say, we're scheduled to be 4 to 6 today. May not have to go that long, so we'll play it by ear, okay? The goal or intention had been to review whatever His Holiness taught, and kind of specifically what was translated into English, because that's what most of you would actually have a chance to understand. But today, His Holiness didn't teach a whole lot. Instead, he gave the oral transmission of the first 150 verses of the text. So I don't have the text in front of me. I'm not going to explain the text until His Holiness does. I'm going to let him do that first. So what I thought we'd do is we would do a general overview of the text, where it came from, what the point of it is. And then there are a few different things that His Holiness mentioned, a couple critical topics. And I thought we'd go into more depth about those. And then any questions or ideas that came up, we can see how it goes and go from there, okay? So the text that His Holiness is giving a teaching on is the 2nd chapter of the Pramanavartika by Dharmakirti. And before we talk about Dharmakirti, we should talk about Dignaga, because Dharmakirti's texts are based on Dignaga's text. So Dignaga was a scholar who was alive in the 5th, 6th century in India, and he was born to a Brahmin family, and he had studied non-Buddhist philosophical ideas, and he became disenchanted with them, and he became disenchanted with samsara, and he renounced his life and became a monk in the Buddhist tradition. And he went to Nalanda, where he studied. And he was there for a while, but then he left to engage in solitary practice or retreat. And that is when he wrote this text, the Pramana Samuccaya, or the Compendium of Pramana. So Pramana means valid cognition, is how it's often translated in these texts. And when he composed the Pramana Samuccaya, when he wrote the first verse, which is a verse of homage to the Buddha, as well as his promise to compose, he wrote that. Some say he wrote it on a slate in his cave, others say he wrote it on the cave wall. But as soon as he wrote it, there are many kind of miraculous signs, like great thunder in the sky and all these other miraculous signs in nature. And so because of that, there was a nearby hermit named Krishnamuni who became enraged. And so when Dignaga went out to do his alms rounds to collect his food, Krishnamuni went and erased everything he had written. And so he came back and he saw that and he wrote it again. And the next day, Krishnamuni erased it again. So he wrote it again. And the third time he said, please don't erase this. I'm, beginning a text to benefit all sentient beings. And then he went out to do his alms, and Krishnamuni came and he saw the note, so he didn't erase it, and he stayed. And then when Dignaga returned, the two of them debated. And Dignaga defeated Krishnamuni 3 times in debate. And so Dignaga said, now that I've been able to defeat you 3 times, you should convert to the teachings of the Buddha. And Krishnamuni became enraged, and using his kind of magical powers, he created this magical fire that burned off all of Dignaga's clothes and destroyed the few possessions that he had. And so when this happened, Dignaga became very disheartened. And he said, if I can't even get this kind of learned scholar to understand the meaning in this way, what chance is there for me to help sentient beings who are suffering so much, who don't have his level of intelligence? So he became very despondent, and he said, you know what, it's not worth me trying. And he picked up the slate he had been writing on, and he said, I'm going to throw this in the air, and when it lands on the ground, I'll renounce all of my bodhicitta, the mind to benefit all sentient beings. And so he threw it in the air, and then it never landed on the ground. And he looked up, and there was Manjushri who had caught it. And Manjushri basically encouraged him. And not only that, he said, I'll protect you, and I will be here for your encouragement as you continue your practice and you work for all sentient beings. And you especially need to write this text on pramana. So, because this text will become an eye for all sentient beings to guide them. And that's how Manjushri referenced the Pramana Samuccaya before Dignaga composed it. So that's the basis for him composing this, And the first verse that he had composed that had been erased over and over again, the first verse is just an homage to the Buddha, as well as his promise to compose. So the first verse just goes, the one who is transformed into the supreme reliable guide, being motivated by altruism to benefit sentient beings, the teacher, the Sagata, the protector, to you I make prostrations. In order to establish pramana, I will herewith create a single compendium of all of my various fragmentary writings. So that's what he had written. And that'll be important in a moment. That's why I read it out loud. So that was Dignaga in the 5th, 6th century, okay? And then Dharmakirti comes, and he's born in the 7th century. And he is also born to a Brahmin family. And in the same way, he studies non-Buddhist philosophy as well as logic. And he gets quite skillful at it. But then he reads one Buddhist text, one Buddhist treatise. And when he reads that, he almost instantly develops faith in the Buddhist teachings. And he becomes a Buddhist monk and also goes to Nalanda. And he specifically wants to study Dignaga's text, the Pramana Samuccaya. So he goes to Ishvarasena, who was Dignaga's direct disciple. And he asked Ishvarasena to teach him this text. And he studied the text from Ishvarasena 3 times. And the first time he taught the text to him, Dharmakirti immediately understood the text at the same level as Ishvarasena. The second time he taught the text, Dharmakirti's understanding was the same level as Dignaga's. And the third time he taught the text, Dharmakirti's understanding was so precise that he was able to point out flaws in Ishvarasena's teaching. And he said, these are not the correct understanding of Dignaga. And Ishvarasena was so overjoyed that his student could notice these flaws that he gave him permission to compose his own text, to highlight what he thought were flaws, and to bring out the true meaning of Dignaga's texts. And so because of that, Dharmakirti went to compose 7 different commentaries on the Pramana Samuccaya. I don't have a clock, that's all. Don't want to get lost what time it is. So Dharmakirti, it's down there. Sorry. Thank you. So Dharmakirti composed 7 different commentaries. We call them in Tibetan tsema dedun, which tsema just means pramana, and dedun means the 7 categories. And so of those 7, the first 3 are considered commentaries that are like a body, and the latter 4 are considered the branches. And so the first 3 are, and the most important one is the Pramana Vartika, which translates to commentary on Pramana, but more specifically, commentary on Pramana Samuccaya. And then he wrote the ascertainment of Pramana and the drops of reasoning. So those are the first 3 that are considered to be body teachings. And they're considered body teachings, quote unquote, because they teach all of the 8 pivotal points of logic. So what are the 8 pivotal points of logic? In brief, the 8 pivotal points are teaching correct inferential cognizers. So minds that correctly realize their object using inference, and then correct direct cognizers. So minds that correctly realize their object using a direct perception, and then false inferential cognizers and false direct perception. So minds that do not correctly realize their object in those 2 different ways, both inferentially and directly. And then he taught the latter 4 are the correct proof statements and false proof statements, as well as correct refutation and false refutation. And what those 4 are the means by which you understand the different types of minds. So a correct proof statement would be a statement such as, sound is impermanent because it is a product, like this. That's a correct proof statement. And then, yeah, I won't go into those 8, but those 8 are the basis of logic. So you have your correct minds, and there are 2 types. There's 2 types of valid cognitions. Those are inferential and those that are direct. And then you have the means to actually ascertain those types of cognition. So when you combine all those are the 8 pivotal parts of logic. And so the first 3 texts teach all 8 of those. So they're considered body texts. The latter 4 texts on Pramana that Dharmakirti taught don't teach all 8. And they're also used as commentaries on the first 3. So they're considered the branch texts. That's the reason. And those 4 are known as the drops of logic, the investigating relationships, proof of other continuums, and the reasoning of debate. So those are the 7 most important texts in Pramana that were taught by Dharmakirti. But of course, of those, the most famous and the most thorough, the largest one, is the Pramanavartika, which is the one we're focused on today. And the Pramanavartika, I have to say, if you read it, it's all in verse, and it's incredibly difficult to understand. Really, really difficult. And for most of us, the only way to really understand it is reading it alongside a commentary, because a commentary from a great teacher is the way to understand what the real meaning is. The commentary we use in our monasteries, and one of the most common one in our tradition, is the commentary by Gyalten called Chalam Sajje, which is the elucidation of the path to liberation. So that's the most common commentary. If you find a translation of the Pramanavartika and you read it, you'll get some benefit, but it's very difficult to understand. So if you've tried to read it, any translation you may have found, and you felt like the whole thing was really confusing and going over your head and doesn't make sense, don't worry, you're not alone. Almost all of us feel that way when we look at the text, okay? But that's the reason we have a whole lineage of teachers who are helping us understand these texts, and that's why commentary texts exist. So we have the opportunity to understand the deep meaning as taught in our lineage by other great renowned scholars. So the Pramanavartika has 4 chapters, and the first chapter is called Inference or Inferential Cognizers for One's Own Benefit. The second chapter is purely on Pramana. The third chapter is on direct perception, and the final chapter is on inference for others' benefit. So when we think of Pramana or valid cognition, tsema in Tibetan, we say there's 2 types in general. They are inferential, the tsemas that are inferential cognizers, and tsemas that are direct cognizers. So the first and last chapters are supposedly on those tsemas that are inferential cognizers. But in fact, the first chapter is more of a general introduction. And the first chapter doesn't actually comment on Dignaga's text at all. It serves as an introduction to the text. And it is mostly based on developing these proper proof statements. Like I said before, sound is an impermanent object because it is a product. How you can tell if a proof statement like that is authentic reasoning or inauthentic reasoning. So the first chapter is mostly devoted to understanding what an authentic proof statement is. So then we get to the second chapter, which is what we're studying today. And the second chapter serves as the commentary just on that opening verse of homage from Dignaga's Pramana Samujjaya. So the whole 250 verses of this second chapter, I think maybe 252 actually, but around 250, they're all a commentary on that very first verse. And actually, I think they're only a commentary on the first 2 lines of that verse. Okay. And so generally we say valid cognizers or pramanas are minds, right? It's a mind that is non-deceptive with regard to the object that it perceives. But in this text, we're saying not only are there pramanas that are minds, but there are pramanas that are beings. They're valid cognizer beings. And specifically, the Buddha is a valid cognizer being. And this whole chapter is proving that the Buddha is a valid cognizer being. So he's not actually a valid cognizer, but when we divide valid cognizer into types, we say in terms of the term valid cognizer, he's a valid cognizer being. And we call him that because through his own power, without any error or mistake, and without any effort, he was able to teach the path to seek liberation to any of those in whatever way they need to reach their goal. So we look at all of the Buddhist teachings that are experiential teachings, and we see that they have no faults whatsoever. And then depending on that, we look at all the Buddhist teachings that were scriptural teachings, and we see they have no faults whatsoever. And then depending on that, we realize the Buddha himself is without fault. And since he was without fault, we consider him a valid cognizer being. So the whole point of this chapter is to prove this. And by proving this and saying that the Buddha himself is a valid cognizer being, so what he teaches is without fault, we are able to then prove the teachings of the Buddha as being without fault. So a good portion of this text is dedicated to proving the existence of past and future lives, as well as to proving how liberation exists and how to achieve the path of liberation. Okay. And actually almost all of the verses that we'll cover today, I think His Holiness was able to go through about 150 verses, give or take. The first set of verses are defining what is a valid cognizer. And then the second set of verses, more or less, are proving why we have past and future lives, using the logic for it. And so there are many different types of logic he employs, but the essence of this logic is that, and again, His Holiness will hopefully teach on this in more detail, and when he does, I will as well. But the essence is that we say anything that exists comes from causes and conditions, and everything has to have a substantial cause that is similar to itself in type. So what that means is every moment of mind has to come from a previous moment of mind. Mind can arise out of form, basically. So a form, such as our form body, our body itself, can't produce mind. So our bodies have the form of our bodies comes from the causes of the semen and egg from our parents. That's the substantial cause of our body itself. But those are made of form, they can't produce our mind. So where does our first moment of mind come from? It has to come from a cause that is similar to itself in substance. So the first moment of mind that I experienced in this life had to come from a previous moment of mind. And if that's the case, then that is serving as a type of logic to prove there had to be a previous life that my mind existed in before this life. Okay, so that's the essence of the logic. Throughout the verses, he's talking about different causes and results, how they work, how they don't work, and many different details. But the essence is our first moment of mind can't be causeless. It had to come from a cause, and it had to come from a cause that was similar to itself in substance. So mind has to come from a previous moment of mind. So therefore, the first moment of mind I experienced in this life had to come from the last moment of mind from previous life. And that's the basic logic used to establish past and future lives. And mostly what was covered today is talking about that, but in much more detail. And so the question is, what is the point of having texts on logic? And there are a number of teachers, both in India and Tibet as well, who said that these texts on logic is a worldly science. It's not a Buddhist science. It's not a spiritual science. You know, we say that there's external sciences, and they delineate 5 main external sciences. And then there's the internal science, which is the teaching of the Buddha. And the external sciences, one is like understanding astrology and medicine and things like this. And so logic is an external science. So if it's an external science, if it's not a spiritual science or an inner science, then therefore we don't need logic to achieve liberation. And the texts on logic by Dignaga and by Dharmakirti and so forth don't teach the path of liberation. So there are many scholars that held this point of view. They held this view when Dignaga composed his text, and in fact, when Dharmakirti composed the Pramana Vartika, he composed the second chapter as a way to refute a lot of those Indian positions. That he says, using logic, I can prove the Buddhist teachings to liberation, and therefore logic is useful in this way. But still, many scholars didn't agree, and then comes Rinpoche, so Lama Tsongkhapa in Tibet, and he thinks that it is incredibly important to study logic to achieve liberation. And we know this specifically because he has a verse in his short prayer called the Destiny Fulfilled. And Destiny Fulfilled is a short text in the Lamrim, basically. And the seventh verse goes, especially for an ordinary person, the sole way to determine the precise reality of things are the treatises on valid reasoning. So with much effort, I study their difficult points again and again. Thinking this over, how well my destiny is fulfilled. Thank you so much, noble Lord, wisdom treasure. So thank you so much, Manjushri. So we see Tsongkhapa clearly saying logic is necessary to understand the path of liberation. And His Holiness did comment on that this morning. He said, the reason we need logic is because it's through logic that we are able to develop a more firm and stable faith, that we're able to develop inspiration in the truth of the teachings, is using logic. So unlike other traditions that say there's a need to have blind faith, Buddhism says you don't need to have blind faith. You can use your own logic and understanding and reasoning to develop the accuracy of these teachings. And then using that logic to develop your own internal understanding, then your understanding becomes much more stable. If you just believe something because it's told to you, then that belief is very ephemeral, it doesn't hold any depth in your heart. So we use logic so then we can really understand these teachings and we have conviction in them. And I don't know if His Holiness mentioned it today, it wasn't in the translation, but the verse that's most often cited in regard to this is a verse from the Ganavyuha Sutra, the Sutra of Dense Array in English, and the verse goes, "O bhikshus and wise men, just as one would assay gold, or one would test gold by rubbing, cutting, and melting it, so examine my words and accept them, but not merely because you respect me." So if someone is giving you a piece of gold, to prove that it's real gold and not fake, there's different tests. And we say there are tests of rubbing, cutting, and melting. And that's how you would prove this actual gold. And so in the same way you would test this gold to make sure it's real, whatever teachings I give, test them in these ways. Use your reasoning and logic to test them. And through that, you can determine their accuracy. And because of that, you can accept them as true and you can follow them. But don't accept them just because you have respect for me. And out of respect for me, everything I say, you accept. That's not the correct way to engage in my teachings. And so if we take this verse to heart and we say that Buddha is telling us that we need to investigate his teachings in order to develop conviction in them, the way we develop that conviction is through using logic and reasoning. And that's what Tsongkhapa is especially teaching us. So that is the reason and the benefit to studying these texts. And studying texts that are in general on reasoning and on epistemology, or like the understanding of knowledge, right? So in addition, Rinpoche's logic said, there are many, at this point, Tibetan scholars who accept that Dignaga had direct realizations of Manjushri, and that Manjushri said, this text you write on Pramana Samachaya will be an eye for all sentient beings. They accept that. But they don't accept that there's a need to study this text of logic to achieve liberation. And so Tsongkhapa says this is absurdly contradictory, right? You can't believe both those things. If you say this text is the eye for all sentient beings to guide them to liberation, you can't also say there's no need to study this text to gain liberation. And so clearly your position is contradictory. It doesn't hold water, So he used that as a way to refute the positions of other scholars. So in general, that is most of what was discussed in the actual text today. I will say that what is also important, and His Holiness did mention, is that both Dharmakirti and Dignaga follow the Chittavamsa school of Buddhist philosophy. So we generally say there's 4 different tenets in Buddhist philosophy. The 2 lower tenets of the Vaibhashikas and the Sautrantikas, and the 2 higher tenets of the Chittamantras and the Madhyamakas. And the Madhyamaka are then also subdivided into 2. And actually they all have subdivisions, but for our purposes, the Madhyamaka are subdivided into the Swatantrika Madhyamakas and the Prasangika Madhyamakas. And we follow the teachings of the Prasangika Madhyamakas, which take their essence from Nagarjuna's teaching and from the Dharmakirti's commentaries on Nagarjuna. So the Pramanavartika is mostly taught from the point of view of this Chittamatra school, this mind-only school, as we'd say in English. However, the second chapter is actually taught from the Swatantrika Madhyamaka view. So either way, it's not our view. So he says we use this text to study logic and reasoning, but we don't accept the understanding of the view as discussed in this text. Instead, for that, we need to rely on text by Prasangika authors and commentaries, such as Nagarjuna's text, the Rula Madhyamaka Karika, the verses on the root verses on the middle way, and Chandrakirti's commentary on the Madhyamaka Karisana. Umala Jumpa is what? It's the Madhyamaka Vitara, entering into the middle way, which is a commentary on Nagarjuna's text. So we can study a text and gain understanding of reasoning and logic from it, and still accept that the view that this text teaches regarding self-grasping, the nature of the self, is not the one we accept as the highest view. So that's an important thing to remember when you're studying texts, especially texts from Indian teachers and authors. They may not follow the same view as ours, so you need to understand that as you engage with them. And so His Holiness did mention that today. So what other points did His Holiness mention that weren't directly related to this text that we can talk about? Well, first he brought up the point that out of ignorance and attachment, almost all sentient beings have more focus on material life and not on a spiritual path. And even those of us who attend spiritual teachings, just because we attend spiritual teachings, that doesn't indicate we actually have a strong devotion to a spiritual life. And the reason for this is because most of our actions are clouded by what are known as the 8 worldly concerns, right? So the 8 worldly concerns are 4 groups or 4 pairs of one thing that we're seeking to accomplish and realize, and one thing we're trying to avoid. So they say that in our lives, most of our activities are motivated because we're seeking out pleasure, we're trying to avoid discomfort, or we're seeking out profit and gain and trying to avoid loss, or we're seeking out compliments and praise and we're trying to avoid criticism, or we're seeking out fame and we're trying to avoid either notoriety or insignificance. And we do this without realizing it, but most of our actions are motivated by one of these 8 thoughts or a combination of them. And if an action is motivated by a worldly thought, it cannot be a spiritual action. It has to be a worldly action. And so if we're under the power of ignorance and attachment, then we're constantly following these thoughts, because these thoughts feed our self-cherishing mind, as His Holiness referenced. And if we're feeding our self-cherishing mind, we're not practicing a spiritual power. So even those of us today, so for instance, I can say an example from my mind. When we were at the teaching this morning, I was taking notes because I wanted to make sure I was able to record everything His Holiness said, so I could do a good job at this review session. And part of my mind was, I need to make sure I do a good job because I don't want people to think about that teacher. I don't want to have that kind of mind, but I do. And when I realize it, I can try to get rid of it, And it's taken a lot of practice to even realize that that mind was there. But for all of my activity that follows that mind, that's not a Dharma activity, okay? It's a worldly activity because I don't want you to criticize me. And in the same way they showed me on the video feed, unfortunately, as I'm scribbling notes in my notebook, my friend pointed it out for me. And the first thing I did is adjusted my robe to make sure I appeared appropriate. And as a monk, it's important to make sure you appear appropriate, and especially in front of lay people, because you represent the Dharma. So if my mind was pure, it would have been, I wanted to make sure that my physical appearance isn't like disheveled in any way, because that could cause people to say, oh, look at that monk, and lose respect for the Dharma. And that would be a valid reason to review my appearance. I can't promise that was the only reason I had. I like to think it was, but I can't promise. So that shows that even when we're engaging in activities that from the outside appear spiritual, we're attending Dharma teachings, we're studying, we're doing these things, if our motivation isn't purely spiritual, it can be mixed with the worldly concerns. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't accumulating virtue, okay? We're doing a virtuous activity the best we can, but it means our experiences are mixed, they're not purely virtuous. They're mixed with worldly Dharma. And that's one of the main things we need to try to avoid if we want to become free from all suffering, and if we want to lead all other sentient beings to complete freedom from suffering. Okay. And what the worldly dharmas are serving, their master, their dictator, is our self-cherishing mind. As His Holiness said, the best antidote to the self-cherishing mind is the mind that cherishes others. But in order to cultivate that, we need to cultivate compassion. We need to cultivate love. We need to cultivate the altruistic attitude. So we call that bodhicitta. But even if you weren't practicing Buddhism, you can still cultivate altruism. And we have to combine those with wisdom. And through that, we're able to defeat the self-cherishing mind. The mind that says, my happiness is more important than anyone else's happiness. And the self-cherishing mind isn't quite so explicit, it's very sneaky. It doesn't go around saying that, but it acts in that way. The self-cherishing mind goes around saying things like, I don't want people to think I'm a bad teacher. That's not the same thing as my happiness is more important than yours. But ultimately, it's the root of that, right? That's where that comes from. So as Holiness mentioned, that it's an important thing that we look at our minds and we see how much of our actions are following worldly actions. And he said, these days, most people are following ignorance and attachment. And then he pointed out that all religions teach or advocate for kindness and compassion. They advocate for altruism, benefiting others. But Buddhism is uncommon in its saying we can use logic to prove these things. We don't use blind faith. That is an uncommon characteristic of the teachings of the Buddha compared to other religions that advocate similar virtuous qualities, such as kindness, compassion, and love. And so when we use logic, terms, His Holiness said repeatedly, I'm not quite sure how they were translated, but the 3 points he made over and over again are, we need to engage in the act of study, which in Tibetan we say nyen, hearing, but it means the same thing as study. And then we have to analyze and contemplate what we studied. So nyen to sam, or to sam gom. So to means to hear something or to study it. Sam means to contemplate or to think about it, reflect on it, try to understand it. And then once we have some sort of understanding, we meditate on it. Okay? And by meditating on it, we are able to feel it deeper in our bodies. That's how we develop a firm understanding. The word in Tibetan for meditation is gom, which can be also understood to become familiar with something. And so I did hear the translator repeatedly say, we become familiar with this. We become familiar with this. That's the same as saying we meditate on this. By meditating on something, we become familiar with it. It becomes our second nature. So if you don't understand the teaching of the Buddha, but you first read it, you study it, and then you analyze it. You try to understand it better. And then when you're able to grasp onto some of those points, then you bring those points into your meditation practice and you really meditate on them and you become familiar with them. And as you become familiar with them, then they become firm inside of you and then you act on them. So when we become familiar with compassion, we no longer have to try to generate compassion towards others who are suffering. It's there automatic. When we become familiar with love, we no longer wish for others' happiness. We need to develop it with some activity. It's there automatically. Okay? So these are the purpose of meditation in this way is to become familiar. And so logic is used in that second step, right? The first step is reading something. We just read a new teaching or we receive a new teaching from one of our lamas. That's the first step, hearing or studying, and then analyzing. This is what logic comes into play. This is why we have to understand the correct use of logic. If this, then that, in that kind of way, you know? So by understanding logic, then we can analyze a teaching. And if we see weaknesses in the teaching, then we consider thinking about that, you know? Just when you analyze, you don't have to accept everything as true right away. That's what logic is for. If you have a doubt about a teaching, then you analyze it through logic and see if it can hold up or not hold up. So, for instance, something that comes up a lot with people that are new to studying Dharma is they don't believe in the teaching of rebirth. And they say, I accept these other teachings the Buddha gave, you know, I believe in all the meditations he taught. I believe in his understanding of suffering and freedom from suffering and so forth. I believe in the idea of karma that he teaches, but I have a hard time believing in rebirth, especially rebirth into lower realms. This is very difficult for me. This is especially true for Westerners. You find Indians and others from South Asian traditions have an easier time accepting this, but Western minds aren't used to it, right? So let's apply logic to that. And so the logic goes, I accept the teaching of karma, but I don't accept the teaching of rebirth. So can that hold up? And we say, well, we see that karma, so the law of cause and effect, doesn't play out in one life almost ever. Because if karma always played out in one life, that means every negative action you did in this life would have a negative consequence in this life. And every positive action you did in this life would have a positive consequence in this life. And if that was true, we couldn't explain why bad things happen to good people. Why do young children die in earthquakes and tsunamis? And why do horrible people who treat others horribly have wealth and goods and anything they want in this life? If karma only existed in one life, the actions in this life took fruit in this life, we couldn't explain any of those situations. But once we understand that the karma we create, it doesn't have to ripen in this life, and usually it won't ripen in this life, unless it's very, very powerful. Usually it will ripen in a future life. Once we understand that, then we can see that karma is a valid teaching. But in order for that to be valid, you have to accept the teachings of rebirth. And so using that logic, we can say the teachings of rebirth are valid teachings because I understand the teachings of karma to be valid. And the only way that they can be understood to be valid is if karma exists from one life to the next. So in that way, we use logic to analyze our doubts. And then that logic helps us get rid of our doubts. And then once our doubts are gone, or at least diminished, then we can meditate on what we have discovered or what we've learned. So those are the 3 steps that Holiness mentioned. And I mentioned again and again in the teachings that we need to study. Study is incredibly important. And then we reflect, we analyze, we use logic. And then we meditate or become familiar with those topics. Let's see. One of the things that came up in the text was in the first line of the Dignaga's text. It says, the one who is transformed into the supreme reliable guide. And so one of the verses that was actually translated in the oral transmission today was, what is the use of the word transform? Why is that word said? And the reason we use the word transform, the reason Dharmakirti used the word transform is because that's showing that the Buddha came from causes. As his omniscience and his identity as a Buddha was the result of causes and conditions. It wasn't produced from nothing. Okay, that Buddhism, achieving the omniscient mind, comes from the causes and conditions that lead to us realizing that omniscient mind. So this is also a way to reject the idea of creator beings that exist without any cause or condition. Instead, a normal mind is transformed into an omniscient mind through the practices of wisdom and compassion and the perfection of those practices. And through that, we eliminate all obscurations as well as the inference. So the word transformed here was used very specifically to say that everything comes from causes and conditions, including the achievement of the idea of Buddhahood. All beings, suffering beings especially, we arise out of our own karmic seeds. So the cause has a result. And that even holds true for Buddhahood. Buddhahood doesn't come from, it's not a non-produced entity. It has a cause. If we take that teaching and we look at ourselves and we say, well, what does it mean that all beings arise from their karmic seeds? We use that as an opportunity to explore the 12 links of interdependence, or the 12 links of dependent origination. Okay. So what the 12 links of dependent origination teach us, they teach us how a single activity creates a karma, and then that karma eventually ripens into a new rebirth. So it shows us the whole cycle from one action to the rebirth as a result of that action. And so I'll go through those very quickly, but again, I'll go through them quickly. His Holiness didn't teach on them, he just mentioned them briefly. But so if we think of the 12 links, first I'll just name all of them, and then I'll explain them briefly. So the first link is ignorance. So it is grasping at the self as truly existing. Okay, that's the first link. And from that ignorance, we have karma or volition. Okay, so we engage in activities that are motivated by that ignorance that grasps at the self as truly existing, and that creates a karmic seed of some sort. And that seed exists within our consciousness. So consciousness is the third of the 12 links. So first ignorance, and then we have either volition or karma. And then the third one is consciousness. Okay. Then they aren't, 12 don't go in the order that we experience them. So I'll go the 12 in order. The next one, the fourth one, is called name and form. It's the link of name and form. And that means the 5 aggregates of our body, right? We say that our existence as beings, we're based on 5 aggregates. 4 of those aggregates are mental aggregates, and the form aggregate is our body, right? The body aggregate. And so the 4 mental aggregates are called the name aggregates, and then there's the form aggregate. And so name and form is representing the 5 aggregates of sentient beings, upon which sentient beings impute the idea of a self. After name and form, we have the 6 senses. So the 5 senses that are based on form, such as sight, smell, taste, touch, and sight, smell, and hearing, right? Sorry. So those are the 5 form senses, and then the mental sense. So it's the 6 senses. And that is the 5th link, the 6 senses. And then we have contact. Contact is when those senses have developed and they reach out of themselves, the sense minds, and they experience an object outside of themselves. That's called contact. And then we have feeling or sensation. And so that's the result of those 6 senses experiencing an object outside of themselves. So again, the first 3, ignorance, karma, and consciousness. And then those 3 are grouped together as one group. Then the next group is a group of 4, and they're name and form, the 6 senses, contact, and feeling. And then we have a group of 3, craving, grasping, and becoming. So craving is when in this life we are craving pleasurable experiences or sensations. And then grasping is that same feeling being multiplied and becoming stronger. And then becoming, I guess, or existence, sometimes they say sipa, is actually the ripening of the karmic seed that was planted before. And that ripening karmic seed is what determines where we're reborn. And that is what brings us to the next link, the 11th link, which is birth or rebirth, followed by the 12th link, which is aging and death. So we have 4 groups here. The first group has 3, ignorance, karma, consciousness. The second group has 4, name and form, the 6 senses, contact, and feeling. The third group also has 3, craving, grasping, and becoming. And then the final group has 2, birth or rebirth, and aging and death. And so the cycle that they work in is that in this life, I experience craving and grasping. And that craving and grasping activates a karmic seed. So the third link from a previous life. It doesn't activate a seed from this life usually, unless it's very, very strong. It activates a seed from a previous life. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. Generally say all 12 of these links will play out, one cycle of 12 will play out in 3 lifetimes. Okay, so as an example, in this life, I have ignorance, right? I have a mind that grasps the self as truly existent. Out of that ignorance, I create negative karma, or positive karma actually. I create karma, and that karma, that karmic seed, rides with my consciousness, and I have that in my mental continuum. So I do that in this life. Okay, and then in a future life, I experience a type of craving that activates that seed. So this is the second life we're talking about, right? It activates the seed from the first life. And then the grasping and the birth are all occurring in that second life, the becoming occur in that second life. And they result in rebirth into the third life, and then the aging and death in the third life. So, okay, I won't do too much more because it'll just get more complicated, and I get to speak the whole 2 hours on a topic it's holiness mentioned in 2 words, which I don't want to do. But generally, we say, according to our system, these 12 links are how we see our negative actions resulting in rebirth. And generally, they take at least 2 lives to play out, because once you plant a karmic seed, it has the result of a future rebirth. So that obviously can't happen in the same life. So they take at least 2 lives to play out, but usually 3. So usually that cycle of 3 happens in 3 lives, sometimes 2. If there's any really big questions about that, maybe we can go over it later. That's the general idea of the 12 links. I'm jumping around a little because I just have notes on what His Holiness said, like little bits in order that he said them, which isn't necessarily the natural order you would teach them in a Dharma talk. So we're going to go a little bit back and forth, okay? Because one of the next things he talked about was he's talking about the types of subtle and coarse minds. And so the minds that are based on the 5 senses, those are only coarse minds. They don't have subtle minds. But the mental faculty, right? The 6 of those, we said there are 6 senses, the 5 senses and the mental sense itself. Those minds have both coarse and subtle minds. And the subtle minds, especially when you study highest yoga tantra, we examine those subtle minds, especially at the time of death, as we dissolve in the time of death, the different types of dissolution. And he mentioned the 80 conceptual thoughts, the black and red appearing, and then finally the clear light at the time of death. So the most subtle mind that we have, what we call the mind of clear light. And at the time of death, this is the last mind to dissolve. Okay. And when this mind dissolves is when we've actually died completely. So when the body dies, it doesn't mean that that subtle mind has died, which is why in the Tibetan tradition and culture, if someone passes away, just because, Western medical science says, oh, they're not breathing, there's no brain activity, they must be dead. Tibetans say, no, that's not true. And there are certain signs that you can look for to see. So generally, if someone passes away, the regular person, we're not talking about a holy person necessarily, but a regular person, we do our best not to even touch their body in any way and not to disturb their body. Because we say that their subtle minds are still engaging in this dissolution process. And there's a possibility, if they are any sort of practitioner, that they're using those subtle minds to engage in a meditative process. And if we touch the body, we can disturb that. And that can influence their rebirth in negative ways. So we try not to do that. And we say that Western science idea of there being no brain activity is only one half of the picture, so the full picture. And so what kind of meditation? We try to wait for 3 days for the average person. We say for most average people, all of those subtle minds will have dissolved within 3 days. And then there are signs we can see, such as blood leaking from the nostrils and so forth, which would indicate that the dissolution is finished. And in that way, we know even if 3 days haven't passed, then it's happened. There are some practitioners who are able to use that most subtle clear light mind to engage in meditation. And that meditation is very profound because it doesn't have the same kind of baggage that our meditation in this life carries, because it's so subtle. It's only using a subtle mind. It's not having to deal with all the coarse minds that most of us live with every day, right? That are at the front of our awareness. And so that's called tukdam. So that's the clear light meditation at the time of death. And as Holiness said, well, there are 2 types of meditation, right? Analytical meditation and stabilizing meditation. And for those that have practiced quite a lot, it's possible they can use the moment of Tukdam to engage in analytical meditation. But if they haven't practiced, then the best they can hope for is stabilizing meditation. So I thought I'd just mention briefly what those three types of meditation are, since they're so important to our practice. So stabilizing meditation is meditation where your mind is focused on a single object, preferably a virtuous object like an image of the Buddha. And you use this meditation to really tame your mind so you can stay focused single pointedly without any effort on any object whatsoever. And to achieve this, we go through what's called the steps, the 9 mental placements to achieve calm abiding, or shine, shamatha, depending on the language you want to go with. And shamatha is a type of meditative mind that says that at any moment, without any effort whatsoever, with great physical and mental pliancy, and the bliss that accompanies that pliancy, our mind is able to focus on any object that it wishes and remain single-pointedly focused on that object without any distractions whatsoever for as long as a period of time as we want. And it takes no effort if we've achieved shamatha. And the good thing about that is they say that you can actually achieve shamatha relatively easily. You don't even have to be Buddhist. If you go and do a 24-hour retreat, maybe 6 months, maybe 1 year, you can achieve shamatha, is what they say. At least some of the lamas say. But the point of shamatha, that's not the end goal, right? Having a very calm, blissful mind that can focus. So we call that stabilizing meditation, right? What's the use of that? Just to be like blissed out all the time, focusing on something, it doesn't get us anywhere. It kind of keeps us in one place. So then we need to use that mind to then engage in analytical meditation. So analytical meditation, there are a number of different types, especially discussed by Chitrapje. But in brief, analytical meditation is when we're actually, doing an analysis of something, right? That's what analytical means. We're thinking about something. So it can be a topic of the teachings. We can be contemplating perfect human rebirth and all the different points of that. We can be contemplating impermanence and death, these things. When we engage in meditation, where our mind is thinking about the different key aspects of part of the path of liberation, we're engaging in analysis. Or we can be doing some type of visualization practice, like many of the tantric meditations. Those are all analytical meditations because we're engaging in some sort of back and forth. We're using our mind in some way to think about something. We're actually inviting thoughts in and using those thoughts to explore a topic of some sort. If we don't have a stable basis, then our analytical meditation is all over the place. I might want to be meditating on love and contemplating wishing for all sentient beings to be happy and have all the causes of happiness. But I keep getting distracted by the pain in my leg or by that person I'm angry at that I don't really want to have. Right? I have all these thoughts intruding. That's because I haven't developed a stable mind that allows me to single pointedly focus on whatever I want to. So as new practitioners, we do both at the same time. We don't say you need to have a perfect mind of shamatha before you can engage in analytical meditation. Because then most of us would never get there, right? We'd stop. But we work on shamatha, then we work on analytical, and we go back and forth, and we do the best we can do. And this is one of the key parts of the Buddhist teachings, is that we have to recognize that we're all suffering beings doing the best we can do. We're not perfected Buddhas. So we're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things incorrectly. The goal isn't to be perfect by tomorrow. That'd be great, but it's just not realistic. The goal is to always do better and use whatever tools we can to move forward on the path of liberation, to move forward on the path that frees us and all sentient beings from suffering. And so that means we recognize that meditating on shamatha and stabilizing meditation improves the strength of your meditation. But we don't wait to perfect that before we practice other types of meditation. Or if we study something like the Long Rim, the sequence of teachings to liberation is taught by Atisha, Tsongkhapa, and other teachers. We don't say, I have to have a perfect understanding of perfect human rebirth before I move on to meditating on impermanence and death. And then I have to perfect that before I move on to meditating on karma, and then meditating on the sufferings of the lower and upper realms and so forth. We move through at the best pace we can. And that's the same reason we go back again to the beginning and start over again. No matter how long we've been studying, we can always revisit a topic and learn more from it. The idea that, oh, I don't need to study the Four Noble Truths. I've already learned that teaching. It's a very foolish way, a childish way to understand something, you know? Every time we engage in the study of a topic, we have a chance to learn something new from it because we've improved our mind in the process. And we're in a different place in our lives, you know? And we can tell this from just our normal everyday experience, right? You may think of a very worldly example. Let's say you know, watch a movie, and the first time you see it, you don't really like that movie so much for whatever reason. But then something happens in your life that maybe is similar to what happened in that movie. And the next time you watch the movie, it connects to you in a deeper way, right? So your circumstances have changed. And as a result of your changing circumstances, you have a new appreciation for whatever it is you're engaging. For instance, we see that in our life. You can find examples, very worldly examples of in our own personal lives. So if that's the case, then the more we study something, obviously, we go back to the early topics, we can learn more and learn them more deeply. Again, by using these three techniques of study, reflection, and meditation. And the more we can meditate on a topic, the more we understand it, the deeper we meditate, the more it becomes intrinsic to our understanding and our practice. And so that's the role, or the role these two different types of meditation play. Now, the benefit of one or the other at the time of death, that's out of my purview. But it's good to know that if we have worked really hard in this life on practicing these types of meditation, and especially if we work on understanding the dissolution of mind at the time of death, and we've engaged in these types of meditation while we're alive, then at that time, we are ready to actually engage in those meditations in real time, so to speak. You know, we're no longer practicing, but doing it in real life. But that's part of the reason we practice in the way we practice, is to prepare ourselves for what our mind is going to experience at the time of death, to make sure we're ready for it, to make sure we have the skills and the tools to approach it in a healthy and happy way, to ensure that we continue to practice Dharma. The last topic I'll touch on very briefly is just that, as His Holiness pointed out, that this is not a text following the Prasangika school, and we have to study the nature of reality based on the Gyalten's teaching and Dharmakirti's teachings and so forth. He mentioned that this is talking about self-grasping. So grasping at the self to be permanent and to be truly existent, more specifically. So this is what we call the fundamental ignorance, that mind that grasps at true existence, specifically grasping at the self as truly existent, and understanding that the self is empty of truly existing is an understanding of emptiness, as we say, which is the key philosophy or philosophical view that we use in Buddhism. And the reason this is important, and it's a very difficult topic to teach and to understand, because it's very easy to think, oh, nothing truly exists, that means nothing exists at all. And then you fall into this nihilistic mind, which is the exact opposite of the truth, right? The Dharma, we say everything exists, but it doesn't exist the way the way it appears to our deluded minds. Okay, it doesn't exist inherently, it doesn't exist truly, and we believe that. We impute the perception of true existence on phenomena. The reason that matters for our everyday practice is because when we can lessen that just a little bit, we can realize that our attachment and our hatred are also due to us labeling things as truly existent. So when I go after something beautiful and it excites my attachment, it's because I think there's some truly established beauty in that phenomenon outside of myself. You know, or when someone insults me and I take offense at that insult, it's because I believe there's some truly established insult, as opposed to just empty words that are butting against my self-cherishing mind. So we have a little bit of recognition that things don't exist the way they appear to us. Then, when others engage in harmful actions towards us, it's much easier to develop compassion towards them, because we realize that they are also under the power of this ignorance. They think all phenomena truly exists, and they're acting as if it was. So they are searching for happiness but all they're doing is finding more suffering. And as a result of that, they engage in harmful behavior, such as harmful behavior toward us. When we realize that, we can develop more compassion towards them much more easily. So in this way, wisdom, the wisdom realizing the emptiness of a truly established self, is conjoined with a mind of compassion and bodhicitta, or a mind that wishes to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. Okay. And so the verse or the phrase this one has said was that bodhisattvas, so beings who have entered the great Mahayana path and have realized bodhicitta, they fly across the ocean of samsara to the far shore of liberation using the two wings of bodhicitta and wisdom. So we often say these two are like the two wings of a bird. You can't have just one. You need both wisdom and bodhicitta. So bodhicitta here is also referenced as skillful means or method. We need both of those. So that mind based in compassion that wants to achieve perfect Buddhahood for all sentient beings needs to be conjoined with wisdom. And the two of them work together. So the greater understanding you have that nothing exists in the way we perceive it, the easier it is to develop compassion and bodhicitta. And the stronger bodhicitta we have, the easier it is to recognize the lack of true existence of all phenomena. So the two work in tandem, and we need to have deep understandings of both. We have to have perfected understandings of both. Or as we'd say, especially with the realization of emptiness, a direct realization of emptiness. So going back to Pramanavartika, we have to have a directly realizing valid cognition that understands emptiness. And in order to achieve that, we first have an inferential cognizer that realizes emptiness. And in order to achieve that, we first have a mind that has a correct understanding of emptiness, but doesn't actually realize it. Okay, so I don't have any realizations of emptiness, but I have an intellectual understanding, right? And so based on that intellectual understanding, which we call a correctly assuming consciousness, based on that, I'm able to meditate, use logic, use analysis, and I meditate. Slowly, that correct understanding can develop into an inferential understanding that actually realizes emptiness. And then I can join that with the practice of bodhicitta, and slowly, and I meditate more, that develops into a direct realization of emptiness. And if you ever heard the term like a noble being or an Arya being, that's a being who has a direct realization of emptiness in their mental continuum. And once we have that direct realization of emptiness, we can't lose it, That's kind of putting us on the fast track to become Buddhist. I mean, still a long way to go, but fast track compared to where we are now, So understanding wisdom, and that means the wisdom realizing emptiness, is important. Emptiness is a difficult topic. And actually, one of the bodhisattva vows is not to teach emptiness to those students who are not appropriate vessels for it, because it is so easy to teach it incorrectly, and so to the students to fall into this idea that nothing exists at all. So because I have such little understanding, and I'm such not a great teacher, I'm not going to try to teach emptiness right now, especially in this short time. But I will say, from what I've said, if you have the idea that nothing exists at all, that's wrong. So please don't hold that idea. And if you're confused about what it means that something exists but doesn't exist truly, that's okay. We're all kind of confused about that. If we weren't confused about that, we wouldn't be suffering. If we weren't confused about that, we wouldn't be grasping at external things as if they could bring us real happiness. Okay? And so there will be many opportunities in the future, hopefully, assuming we live through this evening, to continue studying that in more elaborate ways. But this is not a good forum necessarily to have deep understandings of emptiness. But just know it's complicated. If it wasn't complicated, we'd all be Buddhists, If understanding the Four Noble Truths deeply in our mind without any error or fault wasn't complicated, we'd all have perfected them already. The first teaching of the Buddha that he gave to the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him when he cut his hair and he bathed in the river, when he decided that the life of pure asceticism wasn't the true way to find liberation. And then he achieved Buddhahood. And then he finally gave his first teaching to the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him, became his first 5 students. And the first teaching he gave us on, it's called the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. I think his Holiness did mention that today as well. And he taught the 4 noble truths. The truth of suffering, which is the truth that we have to understand. And the truth of the origin of suffering, which is taught to be the truth that we have to we have to get rid of or negate. And then the truth of the cessation of suffering, which is a truth that we have to actualize in our lives. And then the truth that there is a path that leads to the cessation of suffering, which is the truth we have to practice. So if suffering exists, it has an origin, there is an end to suffering, and there is a path we can follow that'll bring us to the end of suffering. And those four truths are the very first teaching he taught. They contain the essence of all the Buddhist teachings. But since, people like me, our minds are so slow, we can't understand it that easily. So we need these many thousands of discourses and commentaries to try to get little bits of information to get through, the thickness of my skull. For a really exceptional student, you could just hear the Four Noble Truths and you'd already be, an arguably, for most of us, need a little more work, Okay. So for a little over an hour, I think I covered most of the things that His Holiness mentioned. Most of them he only mentioned them in passing. So how about we take this opportunity if there's any questions to make sure I didn't create more doubts, because that would be poor show on my part. So I'm happy to go through any questions for a while. Any?
I don't know, just before I come that I was late, you talk about or not, but I heard when I was listening from radio, mutuality of cause. And before this, I think it was about continuum of mind in the three words. So, but then I couldn't hear.
Yeah.
You want to talk about this?
Yeah, so I did mention this briefly. So, His Holiness was giving us an oral transmission. So what an oral transmission is His Holiness is reciting the text, having already meditated on it and have some sort of realization of it. And he is reciting it so that we can receive the transmission of that text. And the reason this is done is for the text to have a continuous lineage. From the author of that text, he recited it and gave that text to his students. Then it was recited to their students, So we could trace the path of the text directly from Dharmakirti to us through His Holiness Dalai. And so that's what His Holiness is doing today with his reciting of these verses. So when you receive an oral transmission, it often is done very quickly. His Holiness is reciting very, very quickly. And so it's not done at that moment for you to understand the text. It's just for you to receive the transmission. Then once you receive that, then you study it slowly, and you go through line by line, word by word. And so when His Holiness gives an oral transmission like this, often the English isn't able to keep up. And there are a few different translations of this in English. But as I said, this text is very hard to understand the meaning. In Tibetan, it's easier to recite because it's in verse. And in Tibetan verse, every line has the same number of syllables. So you can just recite very quickly. Even if the syllables don't necessarily make sense, you can fall into a pattern very easily. But in Tibetan, if you try to read this, they try to write it to make some sort of sense. So some lines are long, some are short. You can't even get into a rhythm of reciting. And so the translator, the Tsepaklap, was doing his best to keep up with His Holiness, and that is like a never-winning battle, in a transmission. But so that was our experience today. And the truth is, even if we heard every word, it would still be difficult to understand. But so what he was referencing, and I did mention, most of the verses that he covered today, we're trying to prove that the mind has to come from the cause of a previous moment of mind. It doesn't come from a no cause, and it doesn't come from a cause that is different from itself in substance. Like a type of form can't create a mind. Mind has to come from mind. And therefore, the first moment of mind in this life have to come from the last moment of mind of a previous life. And this is the main logic that Tibetans use, Buddhists use, to prove the existence of past and future lives. And in the verses we went over today, he was elaborating on them and elaborating what is a cause, what's the definition of a cause, what's the definition of a result. And so some of the verses you're referencing, that's what they were talking about. Okay.
Thanks, Leanne, for wondering as well. I wonder what the Buddhist position is on the atomic forms or absolutism, and if there are such things as absolute forms, and if that is the case, is there any kind of non-play for hermeneutics or interpretation thing
I'm not sure I know what you mean by an absolute form. Sorry.
Absolute form of happiness or an absolute form of something that exists and is objectively that thing. And it's any interpretation of that thing is perhaps incorrect or incongruous with the thing.
I see. Okay, so the question is regarding this idea of absolute forms, and if absolute forms exist, is there any hermeneutics around engaging them or understanding them? And I think I have an idea of what absolute forms mean, and maybe a little bit incorrect. But we definitely say, for instance, you brought up the idea of happiness, right? So we say that there is an actual happiness, like happiness exists. The problem is what we believe that since we're beings who are under the power of delusion and karma, what we believe to be happiness is an actual happiness. So if you actually knew what real happiness was, and you only work towards that, then you could achieve it, you know? And that's the goal of the Buddhist path, is to achieve happiness for others and for yourself. But due to our ignorance, we misunderstand what happiness is, you know, as an example. That's an important example of Buddhism. Because for the most part, we believe happiness to be something that exists outside of ourselves. We believe happiness is something we can take and hold on to, and it's going to exist in some permanent way. The happiness is truly established. And so, as this Holiness was mentioning, we're obsessed with material life, most of us, not a spiritual life. So we believe these material objects will actually bring us happiness, you know? We believe that the more nice cars I buy and the better clothes I have, those are going to bring me happiness. And as long as we suffer from that delusion, that happiness lies in anything outside of us, we're never going to find real happiness. Because the truth is, all sentient beings are the exact same in the fact that they are wishing to be happy and wishing not to suffer. All sentient beings are the same in that way. And all of us who are under the power of karma and delusion, we go about achieving happiness by running after suffering. You know, because we don't understand what happiness is. We don't understand that happiness is inside our minds. Like we create mind happiness. Our circumstances do not create happiness. And in the same way, our circumstances do not create suffering. You know, if someone insults me and that makes me unhappy, that unhappy mind, that suffering mind of unhappiness, it has nothing to do with the insult someone gave me. It has to do with my reaction to that insult. You know, I generated that mind of suffering in response to my believing that there's some inherent truth to that insult that was given to me. And that is especially because my self-cherishing mind doesn't like to be tested, right? So if we say there are absolute forms, then we can say, yes, there is a real happiness that exists. It doesn't truly exist. Nothing truly exists, but it exists. And there is real suffering that exists. And we usually confuse those two. So yes, there are absolute forms, if that's what we mean by that. Depending on the topic, there are some things we say that maybe don't have an absolute form that are open to interpretation, or depending on the circumstance. So that would depend on the topic. But in general, yes, they exist. But like one good example of something that depends on the situation is, we talk about many different types of minds, or we call them mental factors often. And one of them is like the mind of regret. And so the mind of regret can be both virtuous and non-virtuous, in dependence upon the object that it's focused on. So if I engage in some sort of virtuous activity, like I make an offering to the Buddha, or I do anything virtuous, but then I regret it, that regret is a non-virtuous mind. But if I engage in a harmful activity and then I regret it, that regret is a virtuous mind. You know, so whether regret is virtuous or non-virtuous is dependent upon the object that regret is focused on. So in that regard, we could say that regret doesn't have an absolute form because it's dependent upon the object with which it's engaging to determine its nature as either virtuous or non-virtuous or neutral. So then we'd say there could be both absolute forms and non-absolute forms. Okay. Yeah.
There is one question on the chat.
Okay.
Not sure if you've seen it. For us listening to the channel that has translation, we are mostly hearing the translator, not the Holiness. Do we still get the oral translation?
So the question was, for those of us that are listening to the translation, we mostly hear the translator, not just Holiness. So do we actually receive the oral transmission? My position is yes. Not everyone's position is that way. I know some monks who say that if you aren't in the sight line of the teacher, you don't receive the transmission. And that also goes for initiations and things like this. His Holiness has said that he'll give tantric initiations online. So some of them you can receive through a screen. He says that is acceptable. So if that's acceptable, what's the difference between me seeing His Holiness through a screen and me being a few hundred meters away and me hearing him through translation? It becomes questionable. I will say what I like to do when I'm receiving a transmission. If I want to listen to the translation, I only keep the earbud in one ear. And that way I can hear His Holiness from the other ear. And that way I'm covering both of my bases. Because to be honest, I think the idea of what does it mean to actually receive a transmission is a very complicated thing. And I'm not going to pretend that I have a short answer for it. My belief is that if you're there with the intention to receive the transmission and that your focus is on trying to hear the words of the Dalai Lama or the teacher, whether those words are through translation or directly, and you actually have a mind of, I am here to engage in this practice and to receive this transmission, and you're doing your best to keep your mind focused, you're not chatting, you're not gossiping, you're not too distracted, then with that kind of mind and that kind of motivation, you'll receive the transmission. That's my belief. Okay, that may be wrong. I can't promise it's correct, but the way my teachers have taught the situation to me, I've come to believe that to be the case. And so, yeah, but still, if you can listen in one ear and listen to spitting in the other, just in case, can't hurt, right? So there's a little agnosticism in that regard.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's exactly what the point I said because I've heard for different sections, but there was a talk about and I couldn't get it exactly because it was a bit hard to me, but he was saying something about jumping in the.
Sorry.
I think someone said something about that you cannot jump physically, but you can jump with your mind or something like this, the power of the mind is able to do the activities that physically you cannot do. And this is why the mind is more powerful.
Okay. So I'm not quite sure if this is what you're referencing, but the question has to do with there was some hearing of talking about the power of the mind and the idea that even if you may not be able to engage in an activity with your body, you can engage with it in your mind. And that's part of the reason your mind is so powerful. And maybe it has to do with jumping, we think. So I'm not quite sure what is being referenced in that quote or that what His Holiness said there. But what we do say, and His Holiness did reference it today, part of the reason the mind is so powerful is that, we say there's three types of action. There's actions of body, speech, and mind. And all those actions accumulate come in different ways, right? But of those three, actions of body, speech, and mind, actions of mind are the most powerful because every action of body and every action of speech is necessarily preceded by an action of mind, which we often call the intention or the motivation. And so as a result of that, mental actions carry more weight. They're just more powerful because every action we do has a mental action preceding it and also concurrent with it. So for that reason, mental actions are powerful in that way. I don't know if that's what he was referencing, but that's one of the things that he did reference today at one point. And it's also especially important when we think about the idea of taking vows. So part of the reason we take vows to do something, because vows are a type of mental action we can take. When we take them, they actually develop within our continuum. So for instance, the difference between not killing anything and vowing not to kill something. So I spend most of my day not killing, hopefully. But if I take a vow not to kill, then that same physical activity of not killing becomes more powerful and I can accumulate more virtue as a result of it. So in that way, the mental action of taking vows and vowing to engage in virtuous action and vowing to avoid non-virtuous action is a powerful type of activity we can do. And that's more powerful than the physical activity itself sometimes. So that may be what he was referencing, but I'm not sure. Okay, yeah. Any other questions? I saw one here.
Actually, thinking what my going towards what we said in the part of the text where Dharmakirti explains that an activity like jumping needs repeated effort and you cannot jump infinitely high, whereas the mind.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go. So there's a part of the text Dharmakirti references that physical activities such as jumping are limited by our body. So our bodies create limits to what we can do, both in body and speech, but our mind has no such limits. So, like the physical act of jumping, there's only so high you can jump, no matter how well you train, how strong your legs are. There's a limit that your body won't let you jump past. But your mind doesn't have that kind of limit. So when you engage in meditation, your mind can get deeper and deeper and deeper. And that also goes to the idea that the mind has previous moments that don't have to have a limit in the same, and future moments that don't have a limit. In the same way, our bodies have limits. So that's what is being gotten at that in that section of text. So thank you for clarifying, because I didn't realize.
Yeah, 'cause that was
Sorry.
good, as a good answer to the other one.
But no, it's good. Yeah. I think I saw another question. Yeah.
I got the impression that Buddhism respects science, and how much is Buddhism influenced and shaped by new scientific discoveries dealing with the mind and emotions, which are themselves the result of logic?
So the question says that we're under the impression that Buddhism respects science. So how much is Buddhism influenced by contemporary scientific research, especially regarding the mind? And the Dalai Lama especially is incredibly fond of contemporary science. And he encourages everyone to study it. It's actually required to study now at the Gelugpa monasteries. So that in the future, the monks that receive the Dharmakirti degree actually have to take exams, both written exams and debate exams in scientific topics. And part of the reason the Dalai Lama says science is important is because science is something based on logic. And so if there's something in using scientific logic, contemporary scientific logic, that contradicts the teaching of the Buddha, we should follow the logic, not the teaching of the Buddha. Because you recognize the Buddha was teaching the audience in front of him. You know, every teaching the Buddha gave, he gave it using the skillful means that I am teaching the audience in front of me the thing they need to hear to move forward on the spiritual path. So, for instance, the Buddha taught the moon creates its own light. You know, if you look at the Abhidharma teachings, we say the moon creates its own light. And the Dalai Lama says, you know, when I was a young boy and I received a telescope, I looked at the moon and I saw craters. And I realized those craters were shadows. And if I saw a shadow on the moon, it meant the moon couldn't be creating its own light. There had to be another light source shining on the moon. And therefore, using my scientific reasoning, I can say that the teaching that the moon creates its own light is not a literary teaching, you know? It's not literal to the word. And it was useful for the audience, Buddha taught it to, but I don't need to accept it as a contemporary practitioner. And so now, as 21st century Buddhists, it's important that we rely on science. With that said, there's been a lot, many years, decades of conversation back and forth, especially with the mind and life discussions that His Holiness has hosted and encouraged between contemporary science and Buddhist teachers. I don't know up to this point that regarding the mind and emotions and so forth, the Buddhist position has changed. More so, what we've done is recognized that different types of contemporary science are saying some of the same things we're saying, but using different language. So sometimes Buddhist ideas have become reinforced using contemporary scientific method. And we see that a lot of contemporary science, especially quantum science these days, are talking about ideas of the mind, ways that line up very similarly to the way Buddhist ideas understand the mind. So I don't think, as of now, or as far as I know, any Buddhist teachings on the mind or emotion have changed due to their interaction with contemporary science. But if contemporary science, research, and logic could find a fault in the teachings of the Buddha's idea of the mind, then the Dalai Lama's encouragement would be that we follow logic. If we can follow pure logic to prove something, that's what's most important. So I think right now it hasn't happened in that field, but His Holiness is open to the possibility. He also, I think, we don't think it'll happen. Do you know what I mean? Like our understanding of the mind is one of the best contributions we offer to contemporary science, actually. His Holiness often says that one of the best gifts Buddhism can give to contemporary Western science is our understanding of the mind. Because Buddhism itself is an inner science. It's not a worldly science. And the whole point of Buddhism is understanding the mind. So in general, that's the greatest gift we give to contemporary science, is we have a very complicated understanding of the many different types of mind we have. And we are able to offer that to contemporary scientists and help them in that way. You know, so it's a little bit of that. Yeah.
I have a question, maybe not in the field of what you've been talking about today, but I've been in this place for, I've been in Dharmakirti, I come regularly, and I've been reading these sentences on the wall, saying, like a prisoner being led to a place of execution, with every step taken, then go closer. You cannot remain at ease, thinking that today I want to die. And I understand, right? I fear, I don't understand that there is a fear of death. Even the Buddhist thing, not. So how do you explain that together with the knowledge that there is reincarnation?
Okay. No, that's okay. So the question has to do with in our Glomba here, there are different quotes on the wall, and there are a few quotes here. There are 3 quotes that discuss death. And the first one says, like a prisoner being led to the place of execution with every step taken, death draws closer. And then you cannot remain at ease, thinking, just today I won't die. And then the next one says, but I may well die before I have purified my negative karma. So those are the quotes here. So the question was, these seem to say that we should have a fear of death. So how does the teaching that we have a fear of death line up in congruence with teaching that there is a future rebirth? And the answer is, we meditate on death and we develop a healthy fear of death because that encourages us to practice virtue and to practice a spiritual path. Because rebirth doesn't mean we're going to be reborn into a circumstance where we can continue to practice Dharma. We could be reborn into a situation that's even more suffering than we have now, that we have no opportunity to study the Dharma. And so that we could be reborn in a lower rebirth, or even as a human, but without the opportunities we have now. So when I really meditate on impermanence and death, it says I have all these opportunities available to me now that allow me the right resources to engage in spiritual practice. And when I die, only that spiritual practice is going to help me and ensure that I have a positive rebirth so I can continue to work to free all sentient beings from suffering. Because if I'm reborn as a dog, for instance, I'll have no ability to help other beings at all. I'll be of no use to other beings to help free them from suffering. People enjoy dogs, I understand. The dog himself isn't. Dogs create worldly help. They create worldly benefit, I agree. Some animals can. But the point is they're not actually liberating you from the suffering of samsara, right? They may help you in some worldly way, but they're not able to free you from the subtle sufferings of samsara. So right now I have this perfect human body, and it gives me the freedoms and the leisures that allow me to practice Dharma in a meaningful way. I don't know when I'm going to die. And I usually live my life assuming I'm not going to die. I'm sure everyone in this room here is planning on attending His Holiness's teachings tomorrow morning, right? That means we assume we're going to live through the night, right? We don't believe we might die in our sleep. Any one of us could. There's no guarantee we're going to live until tomorrow. But we live our lives always assuming I'm going to be alive for some indefinite period of time. And until you have a strong sickness, or maybe you're quite old, then you start thinking, oh, I might die soon. But otherwise, we often don't think about it. In general, most sentient beings. So, recollecting that we could die at any moment, we do develop a healthy fear. Fear can also be unhealthy. If that fear stops us from engaging in activity and it causes us to move backwards, that's not healthy. But if that fear encourages us to practice Dharma, then that's a healthy type of fear. Part of the reason for taking refuge, for becoming a Buddhist, quote unquote, and practicing the path of the Buddha, is having a fear of being reborn in lower realms. So this is one of the causes of taking refuge, not the only one, but one. So that kind of fear is healthy. Having a fear of death is healthy when it encourages us to practice Dharma. And we do that so we can not only have positive rebirths, but have the opportunity to lead all sentient beings out of suffering and into the state of the complete bliss of Buddhahood. So in that way, those two teachings aren't contradictory. If we knew that all of our future rebirths would be better than this rebirth, if we could prove that with 100% certainty, then yeah, no reason to fear death. But since we can't prove that, then we can generate a healthy fear of death.
There is one more online question.
Okay.
Concerning the self-cherishing mind, does that mean self-cherishing takes hold of our mind, which is just clear and aware, or is there actually a self-cherishing mind?
So the question is, when we discuss the self-cherishing mind, does that mean a separate mind that takes hold of our mind, which is clear and aware, or is it a type of mind? Is that what it said? So we don't have one mind that's clear and aware. Clear and aware is the definition of mind itself. All minds are quote unquote clear and aware. And what that means, by clear, we mean that all minds are without form. And by aware, we mean that all minds have the capacity to realize the object that they're pointed at. They have that capacity, right? So they're clear and knowing, usually we say, not clear and aware, clear and knowing. And so this is a definition of mind. So within our continuum, we have many, many minds all the time. And these are divided into primary minds and then mental or secondary minds, or I always forget the term, mental factors. Thank you. It's much easier in Tibetan. So we say that we have many, many minds, not just one. And so the self-cherishing mind is one mind that exists in our continuum. And that mind is so insidious that exists almost all the time, if not in a manifest way. It exists in a hidden kind of way. And it's not manifest, but it's still guiding all of our actions. So we don't have one singular mind that's taken over by self-cherishing, but we have, I may have a virtuous mind that wants to help others, and I have a self-cherishing mind at the same time. And those two minds may be working together to cause me to engage in one action or another. We have many minds that exist at the same time. There are some minds that are directly contradictory and can't exist in a manifest way simultaneously. So you can't have a mind of anger manifest in your continuum and a mind of patience at the same time, or a mind of love for that matter at the same time. You can't have both of those simultaneously manifest in your continuum. One of them would be sublimated and one could be manifest, but they can't be simultaneously manifest, So some minds can exist simultaneously. But in general, we have many, many minds that are always kind of moving in and out of our awareness and of our ability to recognize them. If we actually could see all the minds we have, it'd be a lot easier because we could get rid of the negative ones and we could support the positive ones. But we don't. Due to our lack of meditative capacities and having not achieved certain levels of meditative realization, we don't have that clear understanding of our minds. There are some Buddhist teachings, especially when you get into different levels of like tantric teachings, that talk about the pure open mind as being like the pure nature of the mind, right? And the pure clarity of the mind. And we say the mind is like a bright sky, and then the thoughts are like clouds that are adventitious, moving due to circumstances, but they aren't the actual nature of the mind, these negative thoughts. But we can't take that literally, right? That's a type of meditation we can do. But we don't have one mind. We have many, many minds. Even, most of us that have five functioning sense faculties right away have five minds that are usually simultaneous. Our sight, perception, or smell, hearing, taste, and tactile sensation. Those are all different types of mind that are existing simultaneously. And then we have mental, conceptual minds, realizing, looking at the objects of our sense minds, and then labeling it in some way, right? So when I, have a delicious bite of food, and then my taste sensation is eating that cake or whatever, and then I'm saying, oh, this is delicious. That's a mental event happening that's labeling that mind. So in that one action, many minds are happening simultaneously. And so now it's self-cherishing until we're able to conquer it and totally defeat it and get rid of it. There's almost always, at least at a substratum level, within our continuum and affecting the way we engage in all of our daily activities. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
I mean, this might sounds weird, but after listening to you, I'm saying like, when we are saying training the mind, so which mind we are referring to? We are referring to saying all of them, or
Yeah.
what we trying to say.
So there's a whole series of teachings called mind training. And so when we talk, we're trying to train our mind. If we have this almost infinite number of minds, what kind of mind are we trying to train? Right? That's the question. If there isn't one singular mind. And what we really mean by mind training is where we are developing the familiarization or the habits in our continuum to recognize our minds in a certain way. So we often call it mind transformation as well. So when you engage in mind transformation practices, then you're focusing on a single mind that you're trying to transform in some way or change, right? So like we talked about taking different types of suffering onto the path. And those are types of mind transformation meditations, right? We've spoken about those. That's engaging one type of mind to try to transform it into something else, right? So in that one practice, you have one mind you're addressing. But in general, we say mind training isn't training a singular mind, it's creating a habit of looking at different minds. And almost all of mind training is devoted to getting rid of our self-character mind. So if you really wanted to say there's one mind that mind training focuses on, it's focusing on the self-character mind, but it's focusing on it to get rid of it. And it's saying these are all different techniques that we can use to help get rid of our self-character mind. We could say that. We could say that. I don't know if you would really define it that way, but if you wanted to, that'd be one type of mind we're actually looking at in mind training is a self-character mind, but only for the purposes of repudiating it and getting rid of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I had questions about sharing theory.
Okay.
The question is, the even clarity, we develop traits around thinking theory. So why do we have such negative environments? Things that are pernicious or difficult or damaging
Yeah.
that we must get rid of.
So if we think of evolutionary theory, we develop traits that are adventitious, right? That's the theory of evolution. So if that's the case, why do we have mental defilements and so forth? And the easy answer is we develop traits that are adventitious towards what, right? So our physical bodies and mind are developing or evolving in such a way to live in samsara. They're not evolving to be free from samsara. So the character traits that are made prominent are the traits of living in samsara. And that's why we don't naturally evolve out of the adventitious minds and the harmful minds. Then you can also just look at that when you're training, right? If say you're training to do something in the world, but you're training in a bad way, then you're encouraging negative habits, right? So it's the same idea as what are you evolving for? Like what's the circumstance? You all set? Okay. Maybe nothing else? Oh, yeah, there's okay.
When you say positive and negative karma, is it a quality that will give to karma? Because just some thoughts that I think about it, and then karma is just bearing whatever piece that you have made from before. So it's the quality of it being positive and negative, are we transcribing that quality? And also a question earlier about the purification of negative karma. What does that mean? From my understanding, negative karma made with truth, rather than there being an ability to negate karma. And one more.
Okay. Part 3.
Open to do scientific discovery. But my question then is how does Buddhism, I guess, I can't find the word that is support, but I guess I would say adapt to just pure discovery, pure scientific discovery, as opposed to manipulated and skewed sort of appropriate scientific conclusions.
Okay. So the first 2 questions have to do with karma. So when we talk about good karma and bad karma, what does that actually mean? Do we just ascribe a label to karma as being good or bad? Or is there some inherent quality of the karma being good or bad? And building on that question, we've talked about in previous courses and whatnot, the ability to purify negative karma. And so what does that mean? If the whole idea of karma is that negative karma has a negative result, what does it mean to purify it? So those are the first 2 questions. The third question just had to do if science has respect for scientific theory, if Buddhism has respect for scientific theory, how would Buddhism engage in pure scientific new understandings that are developed through science, as opposed to the kind of deductions made through convoluted minds and means by contemporary scientists, if there's a difference. So to answer the last question briefly, I don't know. The last question, the point I will say is that His Holiness says that we should follow logic. And so if there's a scientific proof that is developed through the use of logic, and we can recognize the validity in that, then we'd have to see how that affects our other teachings, and if it causes us to change our understanding of something. As of right now, that hasn't happened for the big picture. It has happened for things like the light giving off its own moon, or the fact that the idea of Mount Meru being a physical place that exists in our world that casts shadow on us doesn't exist. Like these kind of Abhidharma teachings. But as far as our actual theories of mind, there have yet to be anything that we find to contradict them in a meaningful way or with actual valid proof. If something happens, then we'd have great thinkers learn how to adapt, right? But until that happens, I don't have a good answer for that. As for karma, so we say there's three types of karma in general: negative, neutral, and positive, right? And we call karma as being negative or positive based upon the action that generates that karma, and then the result of that karma. So virtuous actions create positive karma, and they have positive results, which is to say results that are beneficial towards practicing the Dharma and to experience actual happiness in some way. And so for that reason, we gave them this label of being positive karma, such as being reborn in a higher realm, such as having a body that works in all of its capacities, such as having access to the teachings of the Buddha and so forth. These are all what we would say the result of positive karma. And negative karma would be the opposite of that, right? So in that regard, we give them some sort of label. The idea of karma being inherently positive or neutral or negative, once we engage in a karmic act, we created a seed, right? Or an imprint. That imprint already has that characteristic being negative or positive, so it doesn't change. But our actions themselves can be negative, positive, neutral, or mixed. And so before that karmic seed is created, our activities, both physical and mental activities, determine what kind of karma there is. So the label of it as positive or negative and so forth is just analysis of that karma. Where did that karma come from? What kind of result can we expect that karma to have? So that's how those labels come. Is it saying, how did this karma come into being? What minds created this? And then what are the results going to be? Are they going to be positive, negative, or neutral? So that's how those labels are given. The idea of purifying karma, we say that karma has four qualities, right? Karma is definite. So a negative action will only have a negative result. It will never have a positive result. And karma increases. So even a small action can have a karmic seed that grows and has a big result, both positive and negative, right? And then we say you can't experience the result of a karma you do not create. So if I engage in a negative action, that negative karma can't ripen in another being. And the last thing is karma won't be destroyed of its own volition. It won't just disappear. So that's the characteristic of karma. But our actions and our minds can cause that karma to be destroyed. Okay. So if we think of karma like a seed, that's the analogy we use. If you burn that seed, it will never grow. Even if that seed still exists, it will never grow. And so when we have positive karma, positive karmic seeds we've created, if we engage in negative actions, those negative actions actually destroy those positive karmic seeds. Those positive imprints are destroyed through negative activity. That's why they say one moment of anger towards a bodhisattva can destroy countless eons worth of virtuous karma that you've created. Right? And in the same way, when we try to engage in actions of purification, those actions are destroying the potency of our negative karmic seeds. So the seeds themselves, the imprints we created are still there, but we rob them of their power. And we can do that on purpose when we're focusing on getting rid of the power of negative karmic seeds, or we do it accidentally when our negative minds destroy the power of our positive seeds. So just because you've created the karma, it doesn't have to write. If you don't do anything else, it will definitely write them. If you engage in some sort of activity to subvert it or to remove its power, then it doesn't necessarily write them. So that's what we mean when we say purifying negative karma. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, related to karma, I'm wondering what's the reason why logic is so effective in making problems. Is it because we purify karma while we're applying logic or debating, or like how does it work? There's many approaches, and how
So the question is, why is logic such a useful way to engage in a study? And does using logical reasoning actually purify karma? Or what is logic doing? Why do we consider it so important? Right? Something along those lines. Logic itself is kind of a neutral, it's a tool. Logic is a tool. So we use logic to gain deeper understandings of the teachings. That's the utility of logic. So even in, as Tsongkhapa said in his Destiny Fulfilled, the sole way to determine the precise reality of things, that means the way things really exist, to really understand the true nature of reality, we need to rely on valid reasoning, which is taught by the treatise on valid reasoning. So if I just tell you that a negative action is going to have a negative result, you have no real reason to believe me. And even if you have some confidence in the teachings of the Buddha, then you say, okay, I believe it. But it's not a deep belief. So it doesn't become something you act on instinctively. And in the same way, if I tell you everything exists, but it doesn't exist the way you perceive it, the nature of reality is not the way we perceive reality to be. You can say, well, the Buddha says that, therefore I have some confidence that that's true. But if you don't really understand it, then we act in such a way without that belief. That belief doesn't actually impact our actions, doesn't impact our mind in any meaningful way. So we use logic as a means to become more and more familiar with the accuracy of the teachings, and then to develop a firm and stable faith in the validity of the teachings. And by developing that faith, that's not based on like a blind trust, not based on mere respect, but based on our analysis and our logic, then that faith causes us to engage in more meaningful activities, and it makes our actions, our virtuous actions, come more easily. So that's how logic works. So logic itself doesn't necessarily purify karma. Logic is used as a tool to create deeper understandings of the meaning of the teachings. And through that deeper understanding, we can act in a more wholesome and easy way. Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
Regarding your example of sound from the beginning, I was wondering, this association between the journal and some kind of internal association. It sounds to me like a Kantian, like subjective realization. And I was wondering if Buddhism was something different.
I'm sorry, that's settled.
What is how is it different in Buddhism the thing that there is sometimes we have some kind of perception of the objective.
I see. So the question is having to deal with the way Buddhism discusses reality not existing the way it appears to us. Is that difference than just the idea that our experience of reality is necessarily subjective, and therefore, due to what's the difference between those ideas, especially Kantian ideas of subjectivity as we engage in reality? And I haven't studied a lot of Kant, so I can't say how Buddhist view compares to that. You could say that our misunderstanding of reality is simply a subjective experience. But the important part is, since we don't realize that, we act as if it was real. That's the difficulty, right? If my subjective experience of a thing is that that thing truly exists, and therefore I act as if it truly exists, that's where I create negative karma. So we could say that the misunderstanding of reality is a mere subjective experience, sure. Because beings who have higher realizations of emptiness, especially when meditative equipoise, don't have that experience. You know, once you have a direct realization of emptiness, when you're in meditative equipoise focused on emptiness, you see things as they are directly. You don't have this subjective experience. You don't see things, you don't perceive things as being truly existent. When you have a direct realization of emptiness and you're in meditative equipoise on emptiness. And a Buddha never perceives things as being truly existent because their level of realization is so strong. So in that regard, the subjective experience of reality, I guess, for all ordinary beings, you could call it that. But the real problem isn't that we have a subjective experience, is that we mistake that subjective experience as being reality. You know, that's the difficulty, that's the problem. So when you have a realization of emptiness, a direct realization, even when you're not in meditative equipoise, you still experience things as if they appear to you as if they truly exist, but you're aware they don't truly exist. So you don't act on them as if they truly existed, because you've had a direct realization of the true nature of reality. So you don't act on that subjective experience because you understand the falsity of it. But until you have that direct realization, most of our activities are based upon misunderstanding our subjective experience and the reality of the situation. So I don't know if that is in line with Kantian ideas or not, but that would be a possible answer. Okay, maybe that's a good place to leave it for today. So we do have 2 more days of teaching, so who knows what will be covered in those. Before we finish our session today, let's just take a moment to dedicate the merit we've accumulated. So today we've come together to study the path of Dharma. We've come together to learn what it means to walk the path that brings us closer to freedom from suffering. We've done that not for ourselves alone, but we've done it for all sentient beings. We've tried to study the teachings so we can have a better understanding of our minds, so we can develop new tools and techniques and understandings that allow us to work for the benefit of all sentient beings, to engage in only virtue. And so, because we've engaged in this virtuous activity of study and contemplation, because we have engaged in the virtuous activity of working for the benefit of other sentient beings, we've accumulated some positive merit. And instead of keeping that merit for ourselves, we dedicate that merit to all sentient beings. We dedicate that merit to all those who are suffering, all those sentient beings who are suffering in this world and other worlds, and may be free from all sufferings. We also dedicate that merit to all of our holy gurus, that they might continue to manifest the display of long and healthy lives, and that all of their holy activities may be realized without any obstacles. We dedicate that merit to all those Dharma centers and other people and organizations that are engaging in holy activity, that are working to free sentient beings, that they may continue to have no obstacles in their work. And we especially dedicate for the perfect, complete enlightenment of all sentient beings. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Venerable Legden.
Mhm.
Tomorrow again at 4 o'clock. If you wish. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
so there'll be another review session tomorrow at 4, both online and in person, for those who are willing to put up with my pratter for another 2 hours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much.